Welcome to the Stanley Spencer Gallery. We are delighted to announce our winter exhibition, Everywhere is Heaven, Stanley Spencer and Roger Wagner. This is our first collaboration with a contemporary artist, and we are delighted to be working with Roger because his paintings have a real resonance with Stanley Spencer's own work. Here we are standing in front of Roger's iconic work, The Harvest is the End of the World and the Angels are Reapers. For me, it is a real visionary work. What would you say to that, Roger?
It was almost the only picture that I've ever done that actually came almost as a sort of vision, which was when I was when I was still an undergraduate, before I'd learnt to paint anything. It was just suddenly appeared in my mind, and I sort of knew I had to paint it, and took me 10 years or so after that to actually arrive before I painted this picture. So yeah, I think I would have to admit to that, term. And
the subject matter is taken from a biblical parable. Could you explain to us a little bit about the iconography?
Well, that's right. It's the parable of the wheat and the tares. So that Christ sort of tells the story of the field which. Of wheat where an enemy sows the tares in, and then the wheat and the tares are sort of separated. And when he explains it, a bit later to the disciples, he has this sort of phrase, the harvest is the end of the world and the reapers are angels. And that's in a way just an explanation of what for me, I wanted it halfway between the story and the explanation, as it were, so that I've got the actual angels as reapers within the field. And in a way, you could think of it as the story is about the idea that though there's always evil in the world, it's not a good idea to try and tear it out, because then you tear out the good as well. And so it is a last judgment in a sense, but it's also a warning that actually the judgment isn't something that we do as well. So it's quite a profound story, and and I'd always felt that sort of Last Judgment paintings had too much of fear in them, and so I wanted, what would it be to imagine the Last Judgment as an English pastoral scene? And so that was it.
Yes, it's quite different if you think about Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel Last Judgment and the fury and the terror. This is worlds apart, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. But having said that, I didn't want to, so there is a sort of threatening sky, and there is a sort of strange light in the thing. So I didn't want to, as it were, just say everything is for the best and the best. I wanted to have that sense, and yet to suggest that actually, that the story ends by saying the righteous shall shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. And so it's intended as that there is a hopeful story, and so I wanted, because then I think that we tend to fixate. I mean, as in the Michelangelo, your eye is seized by the devils with the pitchforks and things, and it's difficult to sort of rise beyond that. And so the wonderful Julian of Norwich has this sort of in her visions, she has this which sort of T.S. Eliot quotes in his poem, that sin is behovely, but all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. And that was something of the feeling that I wanted to get.
And I say, I think whatever one's faith, that is a tonic indeed for our own times and the terrible things happening at the moment, that all shall be well. And
yeah, we need hope somewhere, don't we?
Yes. Yeah. I think one of the similarities you share with Spencer is the inspiration you draw from place. Stanley was deeply inspired by Cookham, emotionally, physically and spiritually, and I think for you Suffolk holds a similar place in your heart, and I believe that this painting was set in the Suffolk landscape.
Yeah, no, absolutely. London, between London and Suffolk are the two places that I was sort of brought up, but they're in just beyond the maltings at Snape, going up to Orford, there's a little road which I'd ever since I was very small, I just loved. You saw the River Ald in the distance, and they had these. Then they had these wonderful rolling sort of fields of great sort of chest-high wheat, and almost the first painting I ever did, I was sort of. I asked if I could. I had a little paint box, and I was sort of set down and I tried to paint that tree. One afternoon, I was just left there, and when my parents came to pick me up, I'd completely failed to capture anything of what I'd sort of seen there. But somehow, the knowledge that there was something that I wanted. So I went on painting that, and this was 20 years later that I finally got a little of what I'd. So yeah, place has always been very. So that was one particular place, and actually I've done hundreds of versions of that particular tree. But also, I mean, the picture just next to it over there of the Thames by Battersea Power Station. Again, where I sort of grew up in Chelsea, and that was for me a very sort of haunting place as well. So,
and that painting was inspired by a poem by a Victorian poet, wasn't it?
Yes, the extraordinary Francis Thompson, who was actually, I mean, he had become at that stage a sort of drug addict. And
he was homeless, wasn't he?
He was homeless.
Yes.
He was living rough on the embankment. And I mean, he wrote the poem so many years later, kind of recalling that. And it has this wonderful sort of lines about seeing sort of Jacob's ladder pitched betwixt heaven and Charing Cross, and then he says, and see Christ walking on the water. Not of Gennesaret, but Thames. And you can sort of see that, in that sort of situation that he was, because he was a sort of strong sort of Catholic and never kind of lost that sort of. But yeah, and so that was at the back of my mind when I was sort of painting that.
Talking of Jacob's ladder and this sort of transition from earth to heaven, I feel trees perform perhaps a similar function in your paintings here, and also in your study for the flowering tree, a stained glass window you did for Iffley Church. And I think trees seem to have a huge symbolic value in that not only was Christ's cross made out of a tree, but they perform this sort of transubstantive experience in a way. I don't know if you'd agree with that.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's extraordinary the way that trees just do go through not just sort of Christian and sort of Jewish literature, but actually through the whole of sort of world literature. So when I did that picture of the flowering tree, which has got sort of Christ actually on a sort of flowering tree, it was again a picture that just sort of came to me as I was sort of playing around on a piece of paper. But someone came up when I did a talk about the thing once, and he said, obviously that's exaggeral. And of course, I had never thought of exaggeral at the time, but this is in the Norse mythology where Odin says, I was on the tree betwixt heaven and earth 3 long days.
I didn't know that. Wow.
Yes, no, it's extraordinary, but it has no connection at all with Christian mythology. And it says, myself sacrificed to myself. It's a most extraordinary sort of poem. But you could find these in all kinds of mythologies as well. So yeah, it is. It's one of these kind of deeply embedded sort of images, which is very sort of fascinating to track.
We have hung this painting next to Stanley Spencer's Last Supper, and I think there's a wonderful visual resonance between the two. The way these sheaves of wheat have been painted by you, and the folds in the disciples' cloth. I think there's a lovely visual resonance. But I think also the way Stanley situates biblical happenings in his own neighbourhood is a lovely resonance between you both. Christ walking on water on the Thames and that sort of thing. And actually it was very interesting you telling me earlier about how you painted the figures of the angels. I mean, Stanley wasn't really into life study so much. He was I think less painterly than you. When this painting arrived, I was really taken aback by the beauty of the impasto of the sheaves of wheat. Stanley was trained as a draftsman primarily, and I think it's very interesting to see the way you both treat paint in a very different way. And you told me a little bit about how you made these figures using models and using swan's feathers. Could you tell me a little bit about that?
Yes, well, that's right. I was. This was the first big painting that I'd ever done. I mean, I'd actually seen Stanley's picture of when I was a student at the Royal Academy. So I can still remember it almost yesterday, sort of coming up from the studios and going into the gallery and sort of seeing that. That was the first picture almost in the exhibition, and being really struck by it. But this painting, yes, I didn't know how to. How I was going to make these sort of figures. So the landscape I was very familiar with, but the figures I had to work out how to do that and how the shadows would form. This thing. So my father had actually been a vintner, so he'd come here to Cookham to the swan uppings, and he always came back with swan's feathers, which he'd give to us as children. So I had a whole collection of these, and so I made these sort of figures, some with plasticine, some with larger sort of wooden figures, and put the swan's feathers in, and then sort of shone a light on them. I made this whole little sort of setup in my sort of studio to see. And I actually managed to. There was a wonderful hardware shop in Oxford which had made its own scythes. So I actually borrowed they lent me a scythe, and I remember sort of bicycling back with a sort of scythe on my shoulder, looking like death on a bicycle. But, so it was a huge sort of learning experience doing this picture, and terrific fun actually. I really enjoyed it.
One of the highlights of the exhibition is a loan from the Fitzwilliam Museum, Stanley Spencer's John Donne Arriving in Heaven. And Spencer's words about that painting have informed our choice of title, because he spoke about these figures in the painting looking north, south, east, west. And he said, everywhere is heaven, so to speak. And I believe you both share a love of John Donne and metaphysical poetry. Although I think perhaps your understanding of John Donne is probably more sophisticated than Stanley's.
I don't know. I think he was actually, remarkably well-read. My teacher at the Academy, Jane Greenham, remembers sort of coming here to Cookham and being shown around by sort of Spencer, and just being astonished actually that he wasn't. Whenever people sort of presented him this sort of slightly naive figure, she said, "Not at all. He was actually very, very intelligent but I loved Donne, but also George Herbert, who was obviously a great friend of Donne, and Donne very much encouraged him. And Herbert has a very similar phrase to the one that sort of Spencer used, where in his wonderful poem Prayer, he talks about prayer as being man well dressed and heaven in ordinary. and it's partly, yes, you say everywhere is heaven, but you could also say that it's the places actually where earth and heaven sort of meet, that actually in the most sort of mundane unexpected things, suddenly you can see the universe in a grain of sand, as it were. That's something that I think I rather, I certainly resonate with in
and I think Spencer too, and he was very fond of Donne's concept of Cookham Churchyard as a holy suburb of heaven, which is why we've got his painting of the angel in Cookham Churchyard, and obviously that was the place for his resurrection masterpieces. I'd finally like to touch upon your painting Ash Wednesday, which, when it arrived, took me back. Such was its beauty. It almost looks like a surrealist work, and if one didn't know that it was informed by T.S. Eliot's poem of the same title, one would think it was, a psychological drama, perhaps. You were Please, it would be lovely to hear about your thoughts on the subject matter. I know that it was done at a time of your life when you were going through your own conversion. And you also painted it when you had sort of come across the works of de Chirico. So if you could tell us a bit about that, that would be great.
Yeah, so that was, I mean, it's almost the first sort of oil painting. It's certainly the first painting I ever sold, and it's the first oil painting I ever sold, and it's one of the. I did it, or at least the idea for it came. I'd been in Italy, and I'd seen Fra Angelico's paintings, which had a huge impact on me, both kind of it inspired me to want to be a painter, but it also changed my whole sort of view of the world. It's something kind of spoke to me through those. But almost immediately after I'd seen the Fra Angelicos, I was in Venice, and I saw a wonderful painting by de Chirico in the Guggenheim Museum, and then extraordinarily met him.
Oh, wow.
And that was the first sort of artist I'd ever met. And he was in his 80s, but so his pictures had a huge sort of impact on me. And when I came back, I'd been reading the T.S. Eliot, which has this line in it: "Lady, three white leopards sat under a juniper tree in the cool of the day." And he thinks of the leopards as rather like the leopards in the wild beasts in Dante, who had sort of devoured him. So he thinks of himself as the dry bones, and then says, "Can these bones live?" It was a poem that he wrote, come as he'd been converted. So it was a very sort of personal poem to him, and it kind of resonated with what I was going through at the time. And so I remember walking along the street and sort of just seeing those lines as a sort of a painting by Fra Angelico or de Chirico or something like that in my mind. And it was, again, rather like this one, it was many years before I was actually able to realize it in a way that sort of satisfied me. But it had been a kind of image in my mind. For years, which I was working on all the time. I was first of all an undergraduate, and then as a student at the academy. When I had an exhibition at the Ashmolean, this was as a kind of retrospective. This was number one, and so it's lovely to put it alongside Spencer's the John Donne Appearing in Heaven, because that was a picture which he did when he was
as
a
student,
Slade.
exactly.
So
yes.
It's just it means a lot to me having those two together.
Roger, you're painting a sacred allegory, Apocalypse. At first glance, looks like an incredibly depressing image. There are bound captives in the foreground, power stations pumping toxic air into the atmosphere, but actually there is a great message of hope in there. Perhaps you could tell us a bit about that.
Yes, well, came out of a wonderful but a very daunting commission that I was asked to do a painting on the whole book of Revelation, which is one of the most sort of complicated and strange books in the whole of the Bible, and so it took me a year to think if I could actually do it. But eventually, I came up with this, or I came up is the wrong word. This picture emerged somehow, and what I felt about it was that I needed not to try and do a literal thing of the book of Revelation, but to use the same poetic imagery that the book used itself. And that book comes out of a time of real sort of horror when Christian communities were being persecuted and people were being killed, and horrible things were happening in the Roman Empire. And these tiny sort of small were trying to cope with that. And so this strange imagery comes out of all that, and so, but it ends up with with all the sort of violence and horror. It ends up with an image of hope in the end, of the New Jerusalem coming down out of heaven, and that's something that people have tried to represent rather literally, and I felt really quite worked. But I had this. I remember going past. It was actually the Port Talbot steelworks, which is in front of a great body of water, and seeing this kind of great city of towers and chimneys reflected in the water. And I suddenly thought, perhaps you could use that image of, because Babylon the Great is the other great image in Revelation of all the kind of Roman Empire. You could have the one image, and then reflected, you could have the New Jerusalem, so that's really that was the basis of this. And then in the foreground you've got the sort of bound captives, and then you have the other two images that come in Revelation are the lion and the lamb. And so in the foreground I've got the lion, who is the same character. So then the slain lamb, which is the idea that actually evil is not defeated by evil, it's defeated by good. And so you have the powerless lamb who is actually changing everything. And so then the idea is that the captives you see in the foreground then reappear in the background, in this sort of angelic dance. So yes, it's an image of hope and redemption.
Again, that's quite a Renaissance conceit, isn't it? Having different iterations of the same people, in the foreground, and then in the background, the next point of narrative. So I don't know if you'd been looking at, Fra Angelico again for this.
Yes, well, Botticelli was actually particularly.
Okay. Oh yes, of course, yes.
And
Botticini even. Yes.
So yes. I mean, all those kind of things were very much in my mind when I was doing that. So yes, I was. It took me almost again a year to paint the picture, but it was a very sort of profound experience doing that.
I must say, for me, it is an extremely eloquent picture, and the way in which you've painted this promise of hope in the water is simply beautiful, and no reproduction can do it justice. And I very much urge all our visitors to come and see it in the flesh, because your pictures really are the way you use paint is such a dynamic and immersive experience. So thank you very much for lending us these pictures and helping us with this exhibition.
Well, it's a great joy, as I say, to have aid, because Spencer has been such an inspiration to me. So to put my pictures alongside his has been and especially here in Crookham, and here in this the chapel where he was he worshipped as a child. So that's all very special.
Thank you, Roger.